Like legitimate businesses where women worldwide are leaders, several women have played significant roles in organized crime. These women prove that it's not just men who are seduced by the power, riches, and risk offered by a life of crime. Today's video will show 10 women who rose to power with their intellect, ambition, and ruthlessness. Number 1. Sebastiana Cotton Vasquez. Sebastiana Cotton Vasquez is a Guatemalan woman whose life began as an impoverished peasant girl in Malacatan and eventually rose to the top of her criminal organization, earning her a reputation as a fierce and violent boss within her country's narcotic trade. Known as La Tana, Doña Tana, or La Doña, she had connections to the Digna Valle cartel in Honduras and the network of Salvadoran narcotic lord Jorge Ulloa Cibrian, alias Repollo, who was arrested in Guatemala in 2013. She also had influential contacts in Colombia and worked as an intermediary for the Sinaloa cartel of El Chapo Guzman. Vasquez used her direct connections to transport narcotics and money from Colombia to Guatemala to be transferred to Mexico and the United States. In February 2012, the Nicaraguan justice system began a trial against 16 people accused of belonging to the Los Charros cartel that authorities caught during a narcotics transaction. They testified that operations were left in charge of a woman, Tana, or La Doña, who was later identified as Vasquez herself. The investigation revealed that she had trafficked 40,000 kilos of narcotics from Venezuela and Colombia to North America, laundered money, and hid real estate and vehicles acquired in the name of churches and by installing 4 hardware stores. Vasquez was one node of a network of women in Latin America, with her closest allies the infamous Marjorie Chacon Rosell in Guatemala City and Yaneth Vergara Hernandez in Colombia. Cotton Vasquez was ultimately arrested by the DEA in 2014 and was out of prison by 2019, with sources in Guatemala suggesting that Vasquez is currently back in Malacatan. Number 2. Griselda Blanco. Standing only 5 feet tall, Griselda Blanco was the head of the Medellin cartel during the 1970s and 1980s. She spent her childhood on the streets of Medellin as a pickpocket, kidnapper, and sex worker. When Blanco turned 20, she married her second husband, Alberto Bravo, who introduced her to the coke industry. She became involved in the cartel, working to push the white powder from Colombia into the U.S. They targeted New York, Southern California, and Miami. Aided by Blanco's creativity, Blanco had lingerie made with secret compartments to smuggle substances, and the couple created an extensive and highly profitable operation. However, Blanco had to return to Colombia in 1975 after facing charges from the DEA. By the late 1970s, Blanco had moved to Miami, where she made her reputation as the godmother. Blanco became one of the world's wealthiest traffickers, bringing in a profit of $80 million a month. Many of the smuggling and unaliving methods she developed are still used by cartels today. She was ruthless against her rivals, with Colombian officials suspecting her involvement in at least 250 deaths in their country and 40 in the U.S. Soon, her rivals targeted her, forcing Blanco to move to California in 1984. However, the following year she was arrested and taken to New York to face the 1975 charges. Found guilty in 1985, she received the maximum sentence of 15 years in prison, though she reportedly continued to run her empire while incarcerated. During this time, officials looked to press additional charges against Blanco, as she was responsible for multiple deaths. In 1994, after one of her assassins, Jorge Ayala, agreed to testify against her, Blanco was charged with 3 crimes. Prosecutors sought capital punishment, but the court threw Ayala's credibility out when prosecutors revealed he had sexual relations with secretaries in the prosecuting attorney's office. In 1998, Blanco ultimately pled guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, and 6 years later she was released and deported to Colombia. Blanco reportedly retired from a life of crime, but in 2012 her life was taken by a gunman on a motorcycle as she left a butcher shop in Medellin. Number 3. Sandra Avila Beltran. Sandra Avila Beltran is Mexico's most legendary female trafficker. Known as the Queen of the Pacific, she has many relations to Mexican old-school trafficking royalties, like the Guadalajara cartel. Family connections have played a significant role in her criminal career. Her father, Alfonso Avila Quintero, is related to the founder of the Guadalajara cartel. Beltran was a powerhouse. While involved in the Latin American narcotics business, she built ties between the Sinaloa cartel and Colombian traffickers. She was dubbed the Queen of the Pacific, sometime after she was connected to 9 tons of white powder seized in a fishing boat off the Mexican Pacific coast in 2001. Police attribute her rise to Juan Diego Espinoza Ramirez, also known as the Tiger, who was an instrumental figure in the then Colombian Norte del Valle cartel. Their partnership enabled business between his production operations in Colombia and the Sinaloa cartel's transportation services that Avila Beltran allegedly linked him up with. This connection made them a fortune, as they moved more than 500 tons of narcotics from Mexico to the U.S. between 1990 and 2004. Her life became a full-time cartel. A sharp learner, she rose fast through the ranks and was coveted by men every step of the way. Gaining respect was so paramount to Avila that she made it a point never to use narcotics herself. To quote Avila, "If you do it, the men think you are just another disposable woman and you won't be respected." And that's what happened until 2002. Her son was kidnapped, and when she paid the $5 million ransom, the police raised suspicions. 4 years and 30 federal agents later, Avila was arrested in Mexico City. She was charged with and convicted of laundering money for billions of dollars worth of narcotics smuggled from Colombia to Mexico alongside Juan Diego Espinosa Ramirez. She lived behind bars for much of the next decade, but in style. While other prisoners had visits in a standard room, guards would escort Avila's visitors to her cell, where her 3 maids served food, alcohol, and cigarettes. Avila finally walked free in 2015 and lived a low-profile life in Guadalajara, Mexico. Number 4. Guadalupe Fernandez Valencia. Guadalupe Valencia, known as La Patrona or the Boss, was among the highest-ranking women in the Sinaloa cartel. She was a fundamental and powerful player who worked for years as the right-hand woman of one of El Chapo Guzman's sons. She moved tons of narcotics to the United States between 2009 and 2014, then laundered the proceeds to cities around Mexico. Fernandez Valencia spent some 3 decades of her life in the narcotic trade. It wasn't until 2009 that she started working for the Sinaloa cartel and her brother Manuel to move coke from Mexico into American cities like Los Angeles. At that point, she was already well connected in the U.S. as she migrated from Mexico to California as a young woman and began dealing with narcotics in the 1990s. She was convicted of trafficking in California in 1998 and served a 10-year sentence before being deported back to Mexico in 2007. She vowed to stop dealing, but was soon back in the business. Although her name is virtually unknown to the general public, she was the only woman named on the charge sheet that helped send El Chapo to prison for life. She was arrested again in Culiacan, Sinaloa, in February 2016, a month after El Chapo was arrested for the final time, and she's been in U.S. custody since she was deported in November 2017. In 2019, she pleaded guilty to narcotics trafficking and money laundering charges in Chicago, avoiding a trial for offering information to U.S. investigators. Due to the time served both in Mexico and the United States, as well as good behavior, she only has around 2 years left to serve the 10-year sentence she received. U.S. District Judge Sharon Johnson Coleman said during the hearing that her cooperation came at risk to her own life and that of her children. Therefore, the whereabouts of her 5 children are unknown. The considerable reduction in her sentence is also a recognition that she placed herself and her family at significant risk by providing substantial assistance against the most violent trafficker in the world. If Valencia is sent back to Mexico after having collaborated with law enforcement and provided information on investigations into other members of the Sinaloa cartel, it would be a death sentence for her. Number 5. Luz Irene Fajardo Campos. Unlike Fernandez Valencia, Luz Irene Fajardo Campos ran an independent trafficking ring associated with but not part of the Sinaloa cartel between 2010 and 2016. A trained lawyer, Campos was a middle-class girl from an agricultural family near Casala in rural Sinaloa, but she got into the narcotics business with her 2 sons. Campos sourced narcotics directly from Colombia, employed pilots, and brokered the purchase of jets to fly the substance to Central America and Mexico. She also oversaw the importation of chemicals into Mexico, which she processed into narcotics at a laboratory in Mexico, then distributed in the U.S. Furthermore, Fajardo Campos paid bribes to law enforcement officials in Mexico and Colombia to import narcotics through an international airport and attempted to bribe public officials into arresting rival traffickers. Fajardo Campos was arrested in Bogotá, Colombia in April 2017 during a business trip and eventually extradited to the U.S. Shortly after that, her two young adult sons, whose names remain unknown, were abducted unalived in the city of Hermosillo. It's unclear whether a rival trafficking organization took their lives or their deaths were a message for their mother to keep her mouth sealed. As a result, Campos refused to plead guilty and went to trial. During the proceedings, prosecutors highlighted the amount of narcotics she trafficked, branded with the words Jenka, and the small planes she bought and commandeered through Honduras loaded with it. Following a 7-day jury trial in December 2019, Campos was convicted of conspiracy to distribute 5 kilograms or more of narcotics and to manufacture and/or distribute 500 grams or more of a different substance in Mexico. According to court documents that show she was sent for psychiatric evaluation, Fajardo's mental state deteriorated behind bars. Likely, the death of her sons weighed heavily on her. She was convicted and sentenced to 22 years in July 2021, substantially more than Fernandez Valencia. In addition to the prison sentence, Fajardo Campos was also ordered to serve 5 years of supervised release and forfeit $18 million. Number 6. Jemaker Thompson. Jemaker Thompson was notorious for contributing to the crack epidemic that the United States of America suffered in the 1980s. Based in Los Angeles, she recruited many workers who helped her distribute narcotics across the country. Jemaker Thompson was evicted from her home at a young age, and her rough childhood made her begin to desire wealth and power. In high school, she partnered with then-boyfriend Anthony Daff Mosley, a dealer and gambler. Their business and partnership were so good that they got married in the 1980s, purchased a home, and birthed a son they named after Anthony. However, the life of crime caught up with them, leading to her husband's death. Everyone thought that Jemaker would quit being a dealer, but her power only grew from there. Thompson knew a lot of things about the business. Although she stopped dealing at the birth of their son in 1982, she was in charge of collecting and accounting for money. After her husband's death, she began to oversee the running of the business and travel on her own. With time, Thompson became international and then made more contacts and networks. She started attending significant events, including boxing matches, where she met a lot of other big names in the narcotics world. She opened up a hair distribution business to launder the finances she received. Thompson, however, was always one step ahead. This business was also to serve as a future fallback business whenever she decided to quit her illegitimate ways. Thompson's days of crime ended when she was 31 and arrested at her son's 6th grade graduation ceremony. Jemaker Thompson's arrest and incarceration follow a betrayal by her business partner and then lover Percy "Cheese" Bratton. Cheese was arrested with narcotics in his car, so he made a deal that required him to provide pieces of evidence that investigators would use to put Thompson behind bars. Thompson was charged with 5 counts of money laundering and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. Ultimately, she was sentenced to 15 years and released after serving 13 years behind bars in February 2005. Now, she has turned her life around. She is an author, speaker, and evangelist who founded the Second Chance Evangelist Ministries. As an author, she wrote the book Queen Pin, a memoir, a journey of her life. The book recounts the rise and fall of her career and subsequently her repentance. Number 7. Yesenia Pacheco, La Güera Loca. Yesenia Pacheco, better known as La Güera Loca or the Crazy Witch, was considered one of the most ruthless women in the history of trafficking. In 2009, Yesenia was introduced to criminal life by joining the Gulf Cartel. No one knows much about her life before this. After a few months, she rose the ranks and became a hit woman whose goal was to hunt down priority targets from their rival, Los Zetas. Due to the brutality with which she eliminated her enemies, La Güera Loca came to be at the top of the structure of the Gulf Cartel. While leading this criminal group, Yesenia Pacheco got a little bit carried away and began her mission to eradicate Los Zetas. kidnapping and tormenting anyone related to their rival. Her manner of executions was cruel, and she did this to convey a message to the other members of this criminal group. Despite being considered one of the most ruthless women in narcotic trafficking, Yesenia's life ended just 5 years after joining the ranks of the Gulf Cartel. In July 2014, Los Zetas leaked a video that contained several kidnapped women. We can't explicitly say what happens in this video, but La Guerra Loca was among these women, and these men took all their lives in the clip. Yesenia Pacheco was one of the first heads of a criminal organization made up exclusively of women and lost her life after Los Zetas sought revenge for the multiple deaths that members of her organization caused. Number 8. Marjorie Chacon Rossell. Chacon Rossell was one of Central America's most notorious money launderers and had connections to the Sinaloa cartel. After finishing high school, she studied psychology for a few years before dropping out and starting some small businesses. She had a head for numbers and, before getting into the logistics of the narcotics trade, was a money launderer who moved the cash profits from deals around the region for her clients. From late 2009 to 2010, Chacon was the president of a company called Broadway Commerce, which Mossack Fonseca created. This company would later be dissolved after being exposed for having connections with Cifuentes, the head of a Colombian family with deep ties to the narcotics industry in Colombia. Chacon was known for being an intimidating woman with a big presence because of the kind of people she was surrounded by and the number of people. At the height of her reign, she reportedly sent thousands of kilos of narcotics through Guatemala to the U.S., laundering tens of millions each month. In her late 30s, she was the mother of 5 and the ruler of a business empire that included hotels, a national lottery, a construction firm, and a high-end clothing store. U.S. officials identified 24 business entities connected to her. Chacon was later accused of illegal activities by U.S. authorities, and a grand jury in Florida filed a charge accusing her of trafficking in August 2011. Chacon turned herself into U.S. authorities in September 2014 and pleaded guilty to trafficking charges in December of that year. After a Rule 35 hearing, in which defense attorneys can present evidence of cooperation to lower the sentence of a convicted felon, a judge in Miami reduced Chacon's sentence from 12 years to 5 years, a significant reduction, which her lawyers said reflected her cooperation. In return, she worked as an undercover collaborator and helped to bring down several major male traffickers, including her former business associates. Number 9. Marixa Lemus. In Ciudad Pedro de Alvarado, on the Guatemalan border with El Salvador, everyone knew and feared the sisters Mayra and Marixa Lemus, who controlled the country's narcotics trade. In 2011, the family decided to nominate Mayra Lemus as a candidate for the presidency of Moyutla, who was already acting as interim president after the death of her brother Magno Lemus, the previous municipal president, from a heart attack in 2009. On February 18, 2011, Mayra Lemus was having lunch at the Los Cuernos Hotel in Ciudad to promote her candidacy when a group of armed men aboard 2 vans stopped before them. Those armed men took Mayra's life that day. According to Marixa, the man responsible for her sister's death was Roberto Marroquin Fuentes, the family's political nemesis. Marixa stepped in to replace Mayra in the mayoral race. To improve her chances of winning, she joined forces with another political and criminal rival of Marroquin's, Ronnie Rodriguez. However, Ronnie's life would also be taken just a few months after Mayra's in June 2011. Marroquin went on to win the mayoral race with more than twice as many votes as Marixa, all of which further antagonized her. So much so that, according to Marroquin, she made 3 attempts to unalive him. By the time the 3rd attempt to unalive him took place, Marixa was already behind bars, serving 94 years after she was implicated in the kidnapping and ultimate death of Amanda Lemus Contreras. Marixa hated being behind bars and became known for her great escapes, earning her the title of Guatemala's female El Chapo Guzman. The first time Marixa escaped was in May 2016, after fellow prisoners reportedly helped her vault over a wall. She was caught within hours, but that didn't stop her from trying again. The second time, in May 2017, she broke out of the Mariscal Zavala military prison. Better prepared this time, she snuck out wearing a guard's uniform and got picked up by a waiting car. When the authorities finally caught up with her in El Salvador 2 weeks later, she dyed her hair a dark red, like that of her sister Mayra. Her capture was a media sensation. Even the president at the time, Jimmy Morales, tweeted about it. Number 10. Digna Valle. In El Espiritu, less than 5 miles from the border of Guatemala, Digna Valle and her family were the providers and the law. They were feared and respected. The Valles grew into a vital go-between for organizations operating across the region. From around 2009 onward, they were moving tens of thousands of kilos of narcotics across the Honduras-Guatemala border every month, making as much as $800,000 from a single shipment for organizations that it provided transportation services to, such as the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. The Valles also had a base in Virginia in the U.S., where employees would receive and distribute substances brought in by the family. Her family was known for their cruelty. Digna's brothers were known for abducting and sexually assaulting young local peasant girls, returning them to their families days after being passed around by the Valle men and their bodyguards. Then her brothers would warn the families to keep their mouths shut. In December 2013, Digna Valle, her brothers Miguel Arnulfo and Luis Alonso, and her son Gerson Stanley Ortega Valle were accused of conspiring to traffic large amounts of narcotics from Colombia to the United States via Honduras. She was arrested in July 2014 at Miami International Airport and faced a sentence of 10 years to life. Digna would only serve half of it after acting as a key cooperating witness in a massive investigation that brought down some of the most robust narcotic trafficking networks in the region. Not just her family's organization, but corrupt political elites. Digna is now free, but is now fighting not to be deported, knowing that if she returns to her homeland, it will be an immediate death sentence for her. Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like more cases like this, let us know in the comments below. See you in the next one.